recording has started. Erin, please share your
Yep.
screen again.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. All right, great. So today this is the basics for forecasting new and non-weather hazards for anticipatory action. Our plan today is to have a short welcome. We'll do a recap from your pre-webinar videos, and then we're going to have an extensive dialogue with a lot of different people today. We have many experts who are coming in to speak with us today, talking about non-weather hazards, epidemics, conflict, displacement, migration, indigenous and traditional knowledge. And then we'll open the floor for all of you to ask questions, and we'll do a Q&A. We'll circulate a number of resources and an evaluation at the end, and then have a half an hour optional after party where people can stay. It will not be recorded, and you can ask even further questions or share ideas at that time. Anita, over to you.
Yes, I wanted just to say we were just incredibly, amazed at how many people signed up for the webinar. In the end, there were 868 I counted this morning. People signed up, and you sent in like over 100 questions, which we kind of condensed, and we have now answered, I believe, all of the questions that you sent in the registration, as well as the ones that went into the Q&A or the chat, which maybe we didn't answer during the webinar, but then we have taken it and answered it in writing. So after this webinar, you will get the Q&A written up for the entire series. So there's 79 questions plus whatever you post today that we have answered. So please, please, please go and look for the question that you asked in the registration, because we took the time to make sure that we had some experts answering them for you. And just in case anybody has to drop off before the end of the hour, we realized that, with so many people signing up, there is obviously a huge interest in getting support for forecasting. It is a really difficult technical topic, and as Erin explains quite often in her videos, it's not easy for somebody completely new to forecasting to understand, but like we want to continue to provide like some kind of resource so that you can reach out for support. So we will on Monday send you like a menu, and you can select from the menu or add things to the menu of different options for ways that we could potentially support you in the future after this. So we won't leave you after this webinar series, and we have all kinds of ideas. They could include more videos. They could include a kind of a help desk. They could include like a informal, like we just meet quarterly and chat, and all kinds of options. So please, 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 if you want to continue getting support from climate scientists and practitioners using forecast and anticipatory action, try to answer that survey that we send on Monday. And with that, this slide, I just want to give a nod once more to the report that has just been issued on the Anticipation Hub. It gives an overview of anticipatory action last year, huge collection of data, 3 Excel spreadsheets that are incredibly useful for your work. The spreadsheets contain all the activations last year, the ones that are currently under development, the anticipatory action plans that are under development, and the ones that are currently in place. And you can filter by country, by hazard, and by actions. So you can really go and look specifically at the topic that you're interested in and find out what's going on and learn from other people. And I mean, thanks to this report, I found out where, for example, anticipatory action for locusts was activated in 2024, and then managed to reach out to one of the speakers. So it's a really useful resource. Great. And with that, I think we can move on to ask Erin to give us a bit of a recap, because there's some very, very tricky hazards out there that we don't see so often in anticipatory action plans. And for that reason, I wanted to ask you the question, is it possible, Erin, to predict and act ahead of volcanoes, landslides, earthquakes, fires? Is it?
Yeah, so I don't cover all of those hazards in these videos. So this is just a plug that if you haven't seen them, do take a look, because I've tried to cover some of the relevant topics. Yes. So you've named a number of hazards that are all a little bit different. What I would say is this. It is very, very difficult to forecast hazards that start below the ground. So earthquakes and volcanoes are in that category, and forecasts are very difficult. However, people are amazing. Humans are so fascinating how we solve important problems. So earthquakes, for example, are so deadly that the government of Mexico has set up an earthquake early warning system that I think might be the record for the shortest lead time anticipatory action system in the world. And the way that works is if there is an earthquake detected somewhere in the country, so the earthquake starts to rumble, imagine like on the coast of Mexico, it takes about a minute or several, maybe 2 minutes, depending on where it was, to reach, for example, Mexico City. So the Mexican government has installed this comprehensive alarm system. So people in Mexico City have 1 minute or maybe 2 minutes, depending on where the earthquake was, to to get out of harm's way. They know what to do. They have safe places in their buildings or they exit the building. And this has saved so many lives. And I like to use this example actually when people complain that we don't have enough lead time for some of our weather hazards, because this is literally a minute of lead time. Of course, it is almost 100% certain what will happen. There's very high certainty, but it is really a remarkable early warning system. But to that point, it is very, very hard to forecast earthquakes with longer lead times. And you asked about landslides. Landslides are also very difficult to forecast. Usually we need some information about the land and probably about conditions that would then trigger the landslide, which would be often heavy rainfall, for example. So there are landslide early warning systems. They often don't have very long lead times either, and they often, they can have some false alarms because it's so hard to forecast. I would say that for some of these hazards, like volcanoes, people have been very creative to forecast the impacts. So they say, well, once the volcano erupts, we have a plume of ash in the sky. And at that point, we can then forecast where will the ash go. So we see very successful volcanic ashfall anticipatory action protocols in different parts of the world. And then the last one you asked about was fires. Fires, so fires can be forecasted on different levels. There are forecasts of what we call fire weather, which say, okay, the conditions are ripe for a fire. You have dry conditions and maybe strong winds that could then propagate a wildfire. The fire weather doesn't always translate into a fire because ideally, especially if you have a forecast of fire weather, people are very, very careful and there is no spark. And so that's one way we prevent the fires to start with. Then, of course, if there is a spark, we do have forecasts of how fires will grow and spread and where they will go. And those forecasts are, of course, in different stages of development in different parts of the world. So that's
so interesting.
Yeah.
Gigma, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming back. Do you have any, I'm putting you on the spot now, but did anything come to mind when I asked that question to Erin? Any examples?
Nothing in particular, but yeah, really stressing that despite having this, I don't know, 1 minute or a few second lead time, I think that this is already some useful information, and it is definitely something that we can actually build on for action. But I actually have a question on another non-weather related hazard. And it will be directed to Catherine from FAO. Actually, from the global overview on anticipatory action from 2024, we saw that FAO reported having activated 3 times on locust outbreaks. So this is really like, I would say, kind of new hazard for us in the anticipatory action, let's say, community of practice, at least for many of us. So I just wanted to understand from you actually, how do you get to start forecasting locust outbreaks? So what are some of the forecast parameters that you are using? What should someone or any a given med service actually be using in order to forecast the occurrence of a locust outbreak?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here and for this important question. I'll try not to be too technical, but the subject is complex. So I'll answer it using the concrete example of Madagascar, where anticipatory action have been triggers in recent years to address the Malagasy migratory locusts. So firstly, yes, we can forecast the locust outbreak. So locust outbreaks and plagues follow well-known epidemiological phases that helps understand how the situation evolves. So we have four situation, locust situation, the recession situation.
Oh, I think we might have lost her. This might be a technical problem. Catherine, can you hear us?
I think until she comes back, I mean, I can give. Are you back? You're back, Catherine. Great.
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know when you lose me.
We lost
a few seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I will close the camera because in Madagascar, I'm not sure about the internet connection, so I will save that. So I was explaining the four locust situations. So after the recession, we have the upsurge. So the first hotspots reappear, and it's mainly after rainfall. And this is the key moment for anticipatory action. If we do not do anything, we may have an outbreak where population are transients or already gregarious with marked gregarious behavior, and the infested area expand and the risk of a plague increase. And finally, the worst case scenario, we have a plague, which is the current situation in Madagascar. So the locusts are massively gregarious, they are highly mobile, and they cause significant damage. It's also important to mention that the Malagasy migratory locust can multiply its population by 60 per generation, with up to 4 generations per year. So within a few months, a poorly managed situation can escalate into a full plague. Then what forecasting system is used in Madagascar? So in Madagascar, forecasting is based entirely on local field collected data, and it's managed by the National Locust Control Center. And the system is built on 3 pillars. So we have the local meteorological data, especially rainfall, used to produce ISOIET maps. Then we have the entomological field survey carried out by specialized scouts, and they collect data related to density, stage, so if it's larvae or adults, and behavior, so if it's solitary, transients, or gregarious. And with those two data, we do a cross-analysis of this data set to produce a locust risk maps. And also, the scout also monitor the greening of vegetation, which is a key ecological signal. So even in the absence of locusts, fresh green vegetation after rainfall indicates favorable conditions for hatching and breeding. In Madagascar, no direct use of satellite data is done. The system is based on human and local observation. It means that the system depends heavily on regular funding. And if resources are lacking, monitoring is interrupted and hotspots go unnoticed and the window for early intervention closes. And then when anticipatory action is triggered, there is no single threshold. Anticipatory action is triggered when several indicators converge. So we have presence of hotspots in non-gregarization zone. We have populations showing transient or early gregarious behavior with increasing density. We can also have the favorable ecological conditions. So I mentioned rainfall and vegetation, and also when the mobility of the locust is still limited. So it's a windows for localized targeted intervention. This was the case on 2 recent occasions in Madagascar, as you mentioned. So in 2021-2022, the situation was in major upsurge. So anticipatory action helped contribute to a broader response to prevent further deterioration of the situation. And in 2024, during an outbreak, early group of gregarious locusts were detected, so anticipatory action fund enabled the rapid mobilization of the response. But it's important to mention that in both cases, anticipatory action acted as catalyst. It was not isolated effort. They bought precious time within an integrated response strategy. And also, I think I have to mention what happens if we don't anticipate. So over the past 30 years, emergency response have cost the international community over 135 million US dollars in Madagascar. It's equivalent to 135 years of locust preventive management, considering 1 year of preventive management cost 1 million US dollar. And the cost of inaction goes far beyond money. It also includes degraded rangeland, less nutritious for livestock, crop losses or damage, changes in farming practice, social impact on rural communities, and also environmental and health consequences, because emergency treatment are broader in scope and quantity. And also, even when FAO protocols are respected, using pesticide increase the risk for pollinator, for fragile biodiversity, which is the case of Madagascar, and for human health, and especially in exposed rural area. So it means that anticipation doesn't just reduce the financial cost, it also helps limit risk to people and ecosystem. And in conclusion, I would like to highlight that a locust plague is not a natural disaster like a cyclone. It's something that is preventable and predictable, but only if we act in time. It means that it requires continuous monitoring, skilled team to detect weak signal, and flexible financial mechanisms such as the crisis modifier. In conclusion, anticipation is less costly, less destructive, and more effective. Failing to anticipate means responding later at a much higher cost. I will stop my intervention here. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any question, I remain available.
Thank you very much. Locust is such a such a wild phenomenon. It's really, the pictures are just so incredible of what happens during these episodes. So thank you for walking us through how they can be anticipated. You're really doing amazing work. So we'd like to turn now to health. So I'd like to introduce Tilly Alkaina, who is a health expert at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Hi, Tilly. Thanks for being with us today. We have so many questions about forecasting health-related outcomes. And so I was wondering if you could talk us through, how is that done? What's the state of the science? Yes, how does it work with anticipatory action for health and disease?
Just a quick intervention. Tilly, is now a good time? Because I know you have somebody coming to the house.
Now is
Is it okay?
perfect in these
Okay.
next 5 to 7 minutes. So hi everyone, my name's Tilly Alkana. I'm one of the co-leads of the Anticipatory Action and Health Thematic Working Group at the Anticipation Hub, alongside colleagues from MSF and UN-OCHA. We do a lot of peer learning between the different agencies, so please join the thematic working group if any of what is presented is interesting. And what we focus on is trying to develop guidance on, say, triggers, which is what I'm going to focus on speaking now in the 5-ish minutes. And also our next focus is on guidance for evaluating anticipatory action for, at the moment, epidemics, because that has been our greatest focus, and certainly looking at epidemics of climate-sensitive infectious diseases, these group of diseases that we know are sensitive to changes in climate, because not only do they contribute to a big burden of disease globally, but also because we know with climate change that there are likely to be effects on the distribution of these diseases, maybe the timing or the magnitude of the of outbreaks of these diseases. So that's kind of why we focused on this a lot. And if we can share the slides, I will run through the sort of 3 overarching trigger approaches that we have for anticipatory action of climate-sensitive infectious disease epidemics. So you'll see here something that's pretty familiar to everyone, an epidemic curve. And the premise with anticipatory action is that we would hope to be able to reduce the impact, i.e. reduce the number of cases of a disease outbreak by doing these actions early on based on any early warning signals. And you see once again anticipatory action, how it sits in this very specific window of all your good DRR, your great public health interventions that you're doing. You have these signals that maybe an outbreak risk is increasing, and you do your anticipatory action and hope that you've been able to, I mean, in amazing cases, prevent the outbreak from ever happening. That's potentially unlikely, but at least certainly reduce the number of people that have become infected by interrupting transmission. And what you see here is the kind of 4 main possible trigger approaches, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So keep that in mind, that much like we heard from the locusts, there may be cases where you have a bunch of indicators come together to suggest that risk is increasing. So if we could just move to the next slide. The first one, next slide again. The first focus is on epidemiological triggers, something that we already do and we're very, very familiar with. It is the current practice that when you see cases emerge, either suspected or confirmed, you tend to start ramping up the kind of disease response activities. Often this is quite a short window, but like we heard from Erin, it's okay to have very, very short windows as long as you're doing something and you're not in any way delaying the response. So there are short windows because the cases have probably emerged in the community, but nonetheless, it's still an opportunity to prevent the outbreak of a few cases turning into a really, really big epidemic. The lead time of how long you have really depends on the disease in question. Like I said, it could be suspected or confirmed, or maybe some kind of relative increase from what your seasonal average pattern might be for that disease. And so in practice, it's really important, keep this trigger in mind, because we suggest that it's often really good to have it as a second trigger, because that gives you the highest confidence that this disease has emerged in the community because we have observed it. But often with anticipatory action, we're interested in extending the lead time that little bit further so that we have more time to do more actions that can help protect people's lives and well-being. So if we move to the next slide, I'll talk about hydrometeorological triggers. Yes, so our extreme weather triggers. Next slide, please. These are already quite well implemented in a variety of early action protocols or equivalent around the world. And the theory or the logic behind them is that if you have a climate-sensitive infectious disease that frequently you see outbreaks of after extreme weather events, then it could make sense to trigger some of your public health actions based on that event, say, for example, flooding and diarrheal diseases. And this is really dependent entirely on the forecast of the hydrometeorological hazard, so the weather forecast. And that gives you the lead time that you have, and it all depends on that kind of skill and accuracy of that forecast. So an example is that the Mozambican Red Cross used a trigger of a Category 3 cyclone that had anticipated speeds of 120 kilometers per hour or more at landfall, indicated by their national Met services. That gave them 72 hours lead time to put in place actions that would hopefully prevent diarrheal disease outbreaks that are linked with the kind of flooding and damage that is associated with tropical cyclones. So that's one possible options that you can use. And then, of course, you can always link it with your epidemiological data to ramp up even more kind of activities. Next slide, please. Then there's this whole combination of kind of phase triggers, which is quite similar to the locust example. Next slide, please, where potentially, I mean, climate-sensitive infectious diseases in their name, we know that they are linked somewhat with climate drivers, but climate often isn't the only thing that drives disease outbreaks. So this kind of trigger approach allows you to input other risk information that might be useful into a bunch of indicators. And when you see them manifesting, you would then say, okay, we need to start triggering some action. So these are kind of a broad range of phase triggers that helps you understand the evolving risk situation. So these amplifying factors could be things like flood or heavy rainfall, but maybe it's not an extreme event of that. It's just an increase or a heavier rainfall than seasonally average before it becomes something extreme. But it could also be to do with population displacement, crowded conditions, maybe malnutrition rates are increasing, or you're seeing water scarcity is increasing, all of these traditional disease risk factors. And when you see them coming about, maybe what you do is actions that target large intervention areas using limited resources that are low or no regrets actions, lots of public health awareness, maybe trying to distribute some more wash kits, things like that. And then when you get your epidemiological data, so the emergence of suspected or confirmed cases, that's when you have really targeted specific actions for affected communities to break the transmission that you know is happening there. So amplifying factors are an example of, once again, pulling it potentially even further earlier than the extreme weather forecast. And then the final type of trigger is building outbreak risk prediction models. And there'll be a link shared in the chat where you'll be able to see a landscaping analysis that looked at all the different disease early warning systems that have been developed. And what we see is that whilst a lot have been developed by academics in partnership, etc., very few are ever operationalized. And so there is like a lot of potential there for humanitarian actors to partner up even more with these academics developing these early warning systems and disease risk prediction models, and seeing can we use it to trigger action in our anticipatory action frameworks. So they're often mathematical models. The challenge with them is that they need a lot of historical climate and epidemiological data, minimum maybe 10 to 20 years, monthly data, so that can be really challenging in our contexts, but they can potentially extend our lead time months before by using seasonal climate forecasts or by also what the outputs of the model are. They require quite a bit of modeling expertise, but some are being developed, so keep an eye on this space. Thank you. Very quick overview.
Great, thanks so much, Tilly. This is great, and I think the graphics are very helpful. I think we have one more question for you from Gigma. Go ahead.
Yeah, you actually mentioned the case of Mozambique, for example, where you were using floods and tropical cyclones to actually trigger early action. So I just wanted to have a more, let's say, a more general perspective on that. What actually do you think is the role of weather and climate services in the development of these epidemic triggers?
Yeah, such an important question. I think climate services, I mean, the crux of them is how to turn climate data, so 2 degrees hotter, or that there will be a tropical cyclone of X magnitude, into the structured information, the climate information that can be tailored as a service to the health sector so that we really understand what these impacts will be. And climate services is a term that is being used quite a lot, and it's basically this entire iterative collaborative process that brings expertise from the climate services and climate sector together with health, finance, et cetera, to identify, generate, build all the capacity so that we can use relevant and reliable climate knowledge to enhance any kind of health decision making. And I think the collaboration is the really key part of that, because it's about bringing those siloed sectors, the climate space and the health space, together, and then that iterative process so that you can really understand what is this climate information telling us and how can we use it? And you look back through historical cases to understand what the historic risks have been on lives and well-being, and then can sort of use that to also understand what future risks might be. So I think it's absolutely the crux of a lot of this.
Thank you.
Thanks. So interesting, Tilly, and I think like kind of that question is really important, because like we see that in so many of the different hazards across the board, that very often you're just it's a matter of bringing together actors amongst the forecasting, world, together with other actors that linked to those hazards that you don't traditionally work together, and then when you bring them together and then the discussions come, then it's actually really beautiful, because this is something that they've both been looking to work on for quite some time. Thank you so much, Tilly. And now we're going to ask Julianne. This is Julianne from the Climate Centre. Julianne, thank you so much for coming today. And you've come to try to talk about probably one of the most trickiest sets of questions we got were on conflict and anticipatory action. So I'm going to ask you quite a provocative question, because I know it's such a commonly asked question, and and quite a tricky one to answer. But still, Julianne, can you forecast conflict?
Thank you, Anita. And it is indeed the basic question we have to start with, right? Similar pitch to Tilly, very briefly, we have a working group that deals with these kind of questions. So if you're interested, I believe Anita will share the links in the chat. And I should emphasize that this is both the question of can we predict conflict and the larger discussion of what do we do with that information is very much work in progress. I am very, very jealous looking at what our colleagues are doing with regard to health risks, with regard to any other sort of non-climate hazards, because I feel like they have it all figured out much better than we do at this point. But that also means there's a lot of space to really figure out where we want to go. But so getting to the actual question, can we predict conflict? The unsatisfying answer is it depends and it's complicated. The key element to that is that when we're predicting conflict, what we're really trying to predict or to forecast or anticipate is people. And people are inherently unpredictable. They're inherently irrational in what they're doing, which makes it very, very difficult to try to really see, where is a certain situation moving towards. And then the other issue that we have is that the question generally comes, can you predict conflict? Well, what even is conflict? We're talking about this very large category of different kinds of settings, of different types of conflict, of different scales of a conflict situation, that we really need to dig deeper and see, okay, what are we trying to predict? Sort of what is the conflict we want to talk about? Are we talking about, for example, local tensions over natural resources? Are we talking about election-based violence? Are we talking about those large interstate conflicts that you will actually see on the news? And if so, what would we need to know for those? So, for example, there are already a couple of forecasting tools that try to predict just broader violent conflict. And generally, they look at fatalities that they expect from a conflict and try to predict over a certain period of time, for example, how many fatalities do we expect in a certain area? Which we can then look at in terms of, well, we think maybe there's going to be an escalation in this part or there's an escalation in that part of the world. But it's a very high level prediction, and it really lacks the sort of local high resolution information that we often need to then inform anticipatory action. So let me dig into maybe one or two of those examples just to show you how we're trying to think about whether we can anticipate different types of conflicts. So quite often the question of natural resource conflict actually comes up. And we can think about whether there is actually a link to weather and climate information that we might be able to predict much better than the actual outbreak of conflict. So what we can do is look at weather forecasts, at climate predictions, and see where might there be areas that are at higher risk because we expect some sort of resource scarcity. But then there will still be 100 other factors that will actually determine whether the scarcity, whether increased competition over resources will turn into some sort of violence or some sort of tensions. So for example, do you have strong local institutions? Do you have local conflict resolution mechanisms? How do communities generally approach those sort of tensions, for example, between different livelihood groups? And those elements are very, very difficult to include in models. We then have a type that is actually quite well represented in anticipatory action, which is election-based violence. And election-based violence is a very, very interesting type of conflict because we generally don't even need a forecasting tool for it. We know when an election will be, and we generally know whether there is a history of election-based violence in a certain country. And just based on those two pieces of information, we can figure out whether we should be prepared to see an outbreak of election-based violence again. So it really depends on what type of conflict are we looking at, what kind of information would we need to inform this action. I think one point that we need to keep in mind in all of this that has been shown time and time again when different experts reviewed the sort of state of forecasting tools that we have, and especially their performance, is that generally we cannot predict the outbreak of new conflicts. We can, to some extent, foresee where conflict escalation is likely. So we're generally not going around sort of predicting, oh, this area will see a conflict or that area will see a conflict, but we're really anticipating changes in the dynamic, sort of increase in intensity. And in a way, that leads us into a similar position to what we heard about all of these other hazards just now, that we're not really predicting the outbreak of something new, but rather sort of monitoring escalating situations to see, well, is there a window for us to plan kind of early actions, early response that can mitigate some of those emerging dynamics. Now, the other point that I just quickly want to touch upon, because I mentioned it earlier, is that we have a couple of tools of predictive models. A lot of them that is a little bit similar to the health colleagues. A lot of these are developed in academia, and they're great. There's a lot of thinking that goes into them. A lot of them actually have pretty good predictive capacities, but generally they are on very high levels and they span large time periods. So they don't actually match what we need in order to inform anticipatory action. And quite often they don't reflect these very, very local dynamics that most conflicts have. So what we see is in the actual application of those, that we need to combine those sort of quantitative predictive models that exist, where they exist, and put them together with sort of more qualitative information, with local knowledge, really with this sort of deeper insight of what a certain situation is like, and then find trigger approaches that sort of combine these two sides of it.
Thanks so much, Julian. That's super interesting. And from the election violence examples I saw, there was really quite some success in, kind of like what the National Society, and I think there was another START network also had one where they went out and kind of did a various rounds of kind of like, peace messaging with like, trusted institutions to try to actually prevent, this escalation of violence. And so some really interesting actions around there. I think Gigma also had a question for you.
Yep. Yeah. My question was actually around the communities that are the most affected by the violence themselves. I was wondering if they do also have a role to play in the forecasting of these upcoming conflicts, for example, or even if they are not actively involved, do you have local indicators that you monitor to see if a conflict is likely in the next few days or weeks?
Yeah, thank you, Gigma. And absolutely, that is basically this part where larger forecasting and predictive models really come together with local knowledge. This is generally involvement of communities where possible and where safe for them to help organizations to keep track of the sort of very local dynamics that cannot be properly represented in models. So for example, things that happen either in a very, very local area, so on a very small scale, or just over very short time spans, that a model that, for example, gives you predictions every month or every 3 months could never actually represent. And it also really shows that sort of this local knowledge of which factors matter is super important, because quite often there are driving factors for conflict or for conflict escalation in a certain area that the people who develop the models have no idea of. It can be very, very sort of localized cultural factors that actually determine whether something turns into a conflict or not. And so as long as we don't actually understand the significance of those factors, we can't really include them in models, right? Or we can't collect the data that would be necessary to feed into those models. And so that's really where the local communities come in. And we've seen this, for example, with the Danish Refugee Council, which is currently trialing an approach to, in the end, displacement. But as part of their displacement model, they are monitoring conflict. So they're really looking at conflict-driven displacement, essentially, which means you have to some extent forecast the conflict itself. And so they are working with local communities to, for example, keep an eye on the recruitment of children into armed groups, which has been identified as a key factor in whether conflict will escalate and they will see displacement. Or just to keep an eye on violent incidents in the area, to look at the arrival of displaced persons from other communities, to really keep track of those very, very local dynamics, and then turn them into risk indicators that in a larger anticipatory action model can really lead to activations of the framework based on those local insights.
Thank you so much, Julianne. This is really fascinating, and I think we could have a whole session just on this. If you take a look, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I'm going to move on to another speaker and let you answer those questions. We are running a little bit short on time. So I'd like to welcome Nick Bodnack to join us, who's from the International Organization of Migration, with a follow-up question here. Nick, can we forecast displacement? So not necessarily conflict, but could you talk to us a bit about forecasting displacement? And just to note that we do have to move pretty quickly. So
no problem.
Thank you.
So I think it's a good follow-on from what Julianne was saying as well, because it is related to some degree with the conflict predictions. Displacement is normally, I would say, the majority of displaced incidences are from either a conflict shock or a conflict incident, or from a climate shock or climate incident. So when we're looking at displacement forecasting, we are obviously looking at a range of shocks and indicators. Predominantly, we are looking at these two. And as Julianne was saying, we are talking about people, and people are very difficult to predict. However, within that, there are a number of models and approaches about looking at both migration forecasting and displacement forecasting. A couple of examples could be looking at IFRC in Honduras, which looks at migration trends and flows to predict above normal or above average increased levels of migrant flows into certain areas compared to what operational capacity would be. So if we're seeing growing trends of people crossing borders, for example, we can predict or have some sort of certainty or understanding about what those trends would be compared to, for example, how many people we might be able to help, given our capacities, which should be used as a trigger mechanism for additional funding, for example. Other alternatives as well are a bit more technical and go down, which we're seeing more and more at the moment, down the kind of areas of machine learning, and AI being used. So the example that was already brought up about DRC's model, which is the top graphic that you can see here, looks at a range of input variables for a random forest model that looks into basically what are the drivers of displacement. We look at conflict, economic shocks, food insecurity, etc. that go into these particular trends. And that gives, with certain levels of certainty, a 3-month forecast, 1 to 3-month forecast based on what those numbers are. Now, that is accurate and not accurate depending on what the shocks are, how intense those shocks are. Major shocks are easier to predict than minor shocks. So normally when you have like a major drought or flood, etc., you start seeing higher percentages of accuracy within those models than others. Another alternative is in the graphic below, is from a private sector organization called Peloria, who's been working with the World Bank, that also uses AI, looking at Machine learning models looks at sentiment analysis and other form of language modeling that not only looks at physical changes and numeric changes, but also behavioral changes within their analysis. So if an individual or an agent is looking to migrate from area A to area B based on a range of factors, do they migrate based on the fact that there are hospitals, I should say, or schools, or do they think about what is the quality of the hospitals or schools? They look at the number of violent events in certain locations, or how they personally feel. If they're from specific groups that might be targeted or discriminated against, for example, that could also be playing into those that don't necessarily come in to those other forms of data that are used in the models.
Fantastic. And sorry, I think I just put your last slide on the screen, but it's really nice to see this like explanation of the partial and complete activation. Great. Thank you for being so succinct about displacement. I think we have one more question for you
Yeah, so
from Anita. Yeah, go ahead.
Concrete examples, like if there's something that's gone on before and that you've seen that's kind of like been implemented, could you give some sort of like concrete examples perhaps of like impact levels, or thresholds that have been used to trigger anticipatory action for migration or displacement? That would be great.
I mean, it's still in its infancy, I would say, but DRC is trialing these, and so their modeling is basically looking at kind of a range of both looking at thresholds in terms of if their model is predicting a certain number of people being displaced from an area, in which case they'll be counting that effectively as a partial trigger, and that might trigger something like a needs assessment or community dialogues, etc. They also confirm and look at a range of actual localized events that are coming from basically local experts and basically a peace building committee of what's happening on the ground to confirm what the quantitative model is actually showing. So if they show, for example, both what the model is showing in terms of increased levels of forecast displacement, and those localized experts are also reporting that there are increased levels of violence or tensions, etc., then that would also go into potentially looking at more forms of activities. This could be activities in the location. This could be looking at as well preparedness activities in areas where we might be seeing increased levels of migration. That's also something that's being used, for example, in the Red Cross approach that I was mentioning in Latin America. And from IOM's approach, we're also looking at this from a different angle, where we're not just looking at forecasting displacement, but also looking at risks to displacees or to those who are already displaced. Obviously, if you are displaced or you're a displaced community, your level of vulnerabilities are usually quite high. And what we often see is that when people are displaced, they still reside in areas that suffer from things such as conflict or climate shocks. So when we see those compounding effects, and in those areas where we have displaced populations, where we might have, say, forecasted flooding or forecasted increased levels of violence or violence directed towards civilians, what kind of programmatic work could we be doing targeting those particular areas, either from a preparedness point of view or from anticipatory action programming tied to specific triggers and thresholds. Now, as I said, it's in its infancy at this stage. There aren't that many thresholds that I can really draw on, except for those examples. The only final one that I can mention is the work that's been done from the World Bank and Peloria, which was looking at increased numbers of refugee flows in Uganda based on neighboring conflicts. And that was also looking into projected increased levels of populations in urban areas that looked at things such as capacity of the education system, capacity of the health system, etc. And that went into quite a substantial, I think it was $200 million package of a developmental response to build that form of infrastructure, knowing that it would be longevity in terms of those population increases and the needs that would be needed to be addressed with those.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to move on to a somewhat, another complex topic. Moving on from this, can I invite Julia Burakowski to unmute and turn on your video? You're from Beltungerhilfe. Thanks so much for being with us today. So the last topic we want to try to cover in just a very few minutes is Indigenous and traditional knowledge. And so could you tell us a little bit about, just starting off, what is Indigenous and traditional knowledge?
Thank you so much, Erin, for this great question. Of course, one I anticipated. So yeah, while you draw up my slides, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Julia. I'm the advisor, meal and capacity of the WAHAFA team at Welthungerhilfe, but I'm also here in my function today as one of the co-leads and support in the global working group on local-led anticipatory action. So really great to be here. If you go on the next slide, I can quickly basically onboard everyone on the basic definition of what it means by indigenous, traditional, and local knowledge. So it's those three which basically form these different kind of knowledges we are talking about when we are talking about these kind of more local knowledge systems. So indigenous knowledge is built over generations through cultural practices, spiritual traditions, and lived observation by indigenous communities, while traditional knowledge includes long-standing practices from both indigenous but also non-indigenous groups, and it's often passed intergenerationally. And then the third category is local knowledge, and this is the one which is more contemporary, and it's rooted in the everyday life and experience of these specific communities. In the following, I will always kind of shorten it to ITK, but just so you know, there's a really good, if this was too fast, there's a really good kind of literature on that, and I think Verena will also post it in the chat. But what else do you need to know about ITK? So basically, these kind of knowledge is culture and context specific, and it's learned from continuous day-to-day observations and experience. It's normally passed orally between generations. It's constantly added to, adapted, and tested, so it's changing. And different knowledge is held by different groups and within different communities. Now with the next slide, I know that oftentimes, especially when you come like me, when you come from Germany, the first kind of feeling you have is, oh, we don't have that. But I can definitely tell you, you in your community, probably there are groups in your community who do have these kind of knowledge. So my favorite example is from my mother. She's using specific days, and if it's this and this cold there, then she will put the seeds in the ground for her flowers. And also my really technical former colleague who was a forecasting and modeling expert, she always told us that she's actually not using the weather app when she's deciding if she can go take the boat in the morning, but she's looking at the sky, and she told us it's called red sky at night, sailor's delight, and red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. So what I want you to do now is maybe take the time in the chat and maybe also share some of your indicators from your local groups, or maybe your own indicators you are using for any kind of hazards. And if we go on the next slide, while you do that, I can give you a short overview. One of my colleagues, Fawad, recently went to South Sudan and collected some of these ITK forecasting indicators, specifically on flood. And you can see here there are different ones. We also looked at the different lead times. So actually, if already in February, the communities are saying that it's unusually hot, then they expect that there's flooding in July and August. So this is a lead time from 3 to 4 months. If they see a lot of large numbers of riverbeds flying towards the community in April, also means in 2 to 3 months, probably there will be floods. If they see a lot of red ants who are currently emerging in bulk near riverbanks, that actually has a shorter lead time, meaning in 10 to 15 days, there will be a flood. And then they have a specific nocturnal bird. And in the local language, it sounds that the sound it makes really sounds like translated, here it comes, and that means in 2 to 3 days, probably the community will be hit by a flood. And even more shortly, when you hear the frogs croaking, a particular type of frog croaking, there's a really imminent threat of flood. So 1 to 3 days, this is then, or even overnight, when they expect to be hit by a flood. So you can see these are all these kind of different indicators we have for indigenous knowledge systems. And then I think there was a question by Gingma.
Yeah, I have one question for you. You know, we always hear like, yes, you need to integrate local and traditional knowledge with scientific forecasting. This is to make sure that there is some uptake from the communities, etc. That is great. But concretely, how can we do that? And great, actually, if you can have, I don't know, 1 or 2 examples to share with us today.
Definitely. Thank you, Gigma. Really great. And I really want to preface this by saying that what we are doing, forecasting and then taking anticipatory action, is actually not something we came up with, but communities have been doing this for centuries. So actually, I wanted to share a personal story, which I've encountered when I did some research in Kenya. And there I met a community and we talked a lot about indigenous forecasting indicators and early warnings. And I met this person, he's called Loki Dokin, and he was telling me that all his life he's basically relying on indigenous forecasting. So he has an indigenous forecaster, which he would always go to and ask, for instance, how do the intestines of the goat look? These are indicating drought. And then also, if a specific star is at the sky, he could also tell if there's floods coming. And based on that, he would take actions. Basically evacuating livestock or taking any other actions. So based on that, there's a lot of activities communities are doing anyway. And if we go back again, I then also talked to Joseph, and Joseph was telling me that when we talk about local knowledge, oftentimes they receive warnings where they being told we need to evacuate and we need to evacuate from community A to community B, but what is not being done is actually telling the community B that community A is coming. And then this is when conflict happens. So they said, please take this knowledge and take it up with stakeholders. We need to have peace agreements in place with community B before we actually evacuate. So having this local understanding, getting it from the community, that just not only warning them that a flood is coming and then evacuating is not helping them. Also making up these peace agreements with the host communities is very much important. So you see there's a lot of understanding of the community, what is actually needed. And then to the next slide. So basically, there are some good practices on what kind of indigenous, traditional, local knowledge systems are being used for forecasting. For instance, Welthungerhilfe in Zimbabwe did a mapping and triangulation of traditional rainfall indicators, and then we looked at how they coincide with seasonal forecasts. In the Philippines, the National Met Office, PAGASA, has basically inventory of traditional early warning signs and then also validated them for accuracy by using scientific methods. In Somalia, defined indicators combined with satellite and matched data to inform decisions by the BRICS consortium. And basically, there are a lot of different small examples. And if you're interested in that more, I really encourage you to look at the working paper, which is stated as a source. And please, if you have good examples, please contact Sören Schneider. You'll see his email there, and also it will be posted in the chat. He really wants to keep working on that and really mapping out what is currently happening, because we know probably things are happening, but we are not really made aware of that. So next slide.
Thank you so much.
Just maybe we can share then in the chat that we do have the working group, and there's also a working group meeting coming up. I can post the details in the chat, and it's basically on traditional indicators. So join the next meeting, let us know, me and Sören, and we'll invite you to that meeting.
Thank you so much. Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that will be really interesting. I'm going to try and join that because I really curious to know how all the different examples. I think we're just at the beginning of trying to gather and learn about what's going on out there. It's really great that you're gathering that for the anticipation community. So just before we kind of wrap up the main session and then have like an open Q&A and maybe even discuss some of the questions that you've been posting as well, I just wanted to kind of like give you a little bit of news and some really interesting things that are going on. So first of all, there's a community of practice had their first meeting recently on scaling up in anticipatory action. That's the grand bargain. So that's really nice to know that there's something going on there, really working together with governments and major donors to see how we can scale up this. And you can read more about it. There'll be some links posted in the chat to read more about that and the kind of like objectives that they're trying to reach. We'll also share a link in the chat as well for the Global Dialogue platform in December to block your calendars. It's hybrid, so you'll be able to follow a lot of these topics in more detail in December online or perhaps in person in Berlin. And then I won't go through the rest. We'll send you in the slide deck these contacts. So if you haven't attended the webinar series yet, then you will receive this slide deck with a list of contacts of different people in the region, so you can reach out to them if you need some technical support or some support in connecting to the anticipatory action technical working groups in your countries. And then the last two slides as well that we'll send you, they'll just show you the different working groups that we have going on, where you can also go to for more technical support. I'm also going to share with you now quickly in the chat a very short 2-question evaluation from the videos that Erin released on these topics, on this topic this week, and today's webinar. It would be wonderful if you could just give us a little bit of feedback on that. And I think with that, I think we can wrap up and then get to the juicy questions that everybody has. So, Michael, I think you're going to switch off the recording now, if I understood correctly.